Muy buenos días, Ian.
Buenos dias. Muy buenos dias. In fact.
Muy buenos, because today we're gonna cover chapter 25, matter and
Yes.
consciousness. I'm very,
Yes.
very much looking forward to
Well, yes, I
it.
am too. This is such an amazing topic, isn't it?
Indeed, indeed. And a lot has been written about it, and it's fascinating to read, but also often frustrating for me to read all these new theories of consciousness and materialism reloaded and revisited and so on. And
Yeah.
again, I think you did more than a good job in this chapter in offering really a different way to see this problem. So let's get into it.
Yes. I mean, I suppose one of there are many disadvantages to writing a very long book that takes in many topics, but one advantage is that what I hope I present is a coherent vision overall, so that one doesn't come away from reading about consciousness and think, well, where does that leave us, philosophically speaking, in the world? And I'm hoping that there is something special and valuable about having a coherent vision across a large number of chapters.
Indeed, this happens, and at least to me as a reader, it's happening more and more as now we're reaching towards the end, that there's this kind of like resonances. Maybe you like to bring forth music. Maybe there's like I think I've got the harmony of this whole masterpiece of yours, and now it's like, okay, now we're gonna hear this whatever, this sonata or this movement about consciousness, but it's within a harmony, and that makes it much more. Despite how difficult these topics are, there's a sense of familiarity that's achieved by you holding us through all these many pages with really a coherent vision, as you were saying some seconds ago. Yes.
Good. Well, I'm glad that's your experience, because it was my hope. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so this chapter is only 80 pages, right?
Oh, only 8 pages.
Many people would change the font and would publish a book about consciousness with this chapter. Let me just mention that. Okay, let's get into it. So, as always, the starting quotes are very revealing of what's to come. And there's this one by James that it reads, mental and physical events, and then they're the strongest contrast in the entire field of being. The strongest contrast.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's
they
the
do
contrast.
normally.
Yeah, that's the contrast you're gonna hold. The
Yes.
tension you're gonna hold, and maybe not solve, but probably resolve in a way. This contrast is gonna be there throughout the chapter.
Yes, that's a good point, really, because I think what I try to hold is that there are, the difference that we feel, our intuition from experience, that these things are not to be collapsed, is correct, and yet that they're not sundered at all. I'm proposing something that avoids what often happens in discussions of consciousness, which is to lapse into a position where basically the only thing that has reality is matter, or the only thing that has reality is consciousness.
Yes. And I sense there, again, in your tone of being and of writing and of speaking, this necessary patience. You have a necessary patience for these things. Probably you get impatient sometimes listening to some of some people talking about consciousness. So do I. But what I mean by patience is that, again, we're going to go through these 80 pages as best as we can. And you're, with a lot of care, you're holding this position, and then you're not rushing. I mean, this is another thing. It's more meta level, and we haven't gotten into the content yet, but that's not hurry. but something that I was curious when I first read this chapter. I was curious as to, okay, how is Ian going to do it? And the usual thing is to say, the usual thing is, if you're an academic, is to start in the 90s, right? with Koch and Crick, as if nothing really had
Yes.
happened before that. It's like, it's kind of an academic constraint, you know? And then very quickly you start like putting on the table all the isms as if they were cards. That we have this ism, this ism, this ism, and then kind of quickly dismiss those that you don't like, and then present your own theory. This is kind of the standard way of doing it. And it's so infertile. It's not fertile for thought. And you didn't do it. You did it in a very different way. Just the way you approached it. Even before, in a way, listening what you had to say, just the way you did it was already something different, I must say.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay. So back to the contrast. And as you're right, consciousness is the most familiar and probably the most astounding, not outstanding, astounding. Well, phenomena or event or thing to consider. And so when we speak about the mind and the brain, you're right that the existence of the relationship between both brain and mind is perhaps rather undisputed, but the nature, and that's the whole crux of it, the nature of this relationship, that's what's disputable and very disputable. So again, let's start to bring in subtlety, nuance to this. So it's about what do we do with these two and how they relate.
Well, I start by, as you say, pointing out that for several thousand years, people have noticed the extraordinary closeness of brain function with mind. And I begin actually with Lucretius, who had many incontrovertible observations to make. You know, that when somebody has a head injury, it can change their personality. The influence of drugs or alcohol or epilepsy, which are brain conditions, can alter the mental condition and so forth. So, I mean, he saw very clearly that these were related. But I begin by making a first attempt at what this relationship might be by dividing it into three possibilities that I think we've mentioned before, but I'll just mention them again. Effectively, the relationship between the brain and the mind can be one of emission, transmission, or permission, and the one that is virtually holding the field for most reductionist scientists is emission. Nobody has the slightest idea after a century of at least of banging away at this hard problem how consciousness should emerge from an entirely unconscious lump of matter. So I consider that easily the least plausible. And that's borne out by the complete failure so far to find any way of doing this magic trick. Much more likely is that it transmits consciousness, or for me, permits consciousness, which is a similar idea that consciousness is not created by the brain, comes through the brain, but the brain is, if you like, a sculptor of consciousness. It's a filter of consciousness. It shapes and forms what is the individual consciousness that brain is attached to while I or you are alive. So those are the possible runners. and I think what I do is I work through the chapter in a fairly logical way, saying, where do these possibilities take us?
Exactly. And I don't know what your readers and your listeners would think, but just saying that matter gives rise to mind, it's often taken as a given. It's even considered as scientific, like a consumed scientific fact, and it's very important to start by saying, well, hold on, this is certainly a philosophical position, and maybe an ideological bias that sneaked in the science of the mind of today. And so already by making this distinction that comes from William James and probably before, of emission and then transmission, and probably the most important one, permission, these three ways, or maybe these two ways that then one branches into two, these already zoom out sufficiently so that we can see really the forest and not all these physicalist trees where emission is the only way, because they would agree with you. They would say, well, we really have no idea yet about how the brain could emit consciousness, but it must. They would say it must. Why? Because how else? So already there's kind of a failure of imagination to begin with, and so the how else betrays that these other provinces are really outside of their purview to begin with.
I think it's necessitated by a perfectly reasonable principle, which is that we should explain the more difficult by the more familiar. So things that are harder to explain should be explained in terms of things that are easier to explain. So this is based on the presumption that matter is something we really know and understand. But unfortunately, we don't. We don't have any idea what matter is. And when neuroscientists and reductionist scientists of whatever kind present themselves as being hard-nosed, and taking no nonsense, and it really must all come out of matter. The physicists sigh a little, and as Adam Frank, a physicist in New York, says, we find ourselves looking at our feet, mumbling sheepishly, it's complicated, because matter is something that they don't know what it is. But the one thing they do know about it is that it cannot be separated from consciousness. And he puts it rather simply, that the idea that that mind could depend on matter, that in turn depends on mind, doesn't offer the safe anchor and familiarity that is wished for by these reductionists.
Yes. And maybe we'll reach that again in the end, but that could be a call for, well, some people call it post-materialism. I like to call it transmaterialism. Maybe the idea that a way to get over these debates in a productive way is to realize that both hardcore materialists and those of us who want to go beyond really will meet again in a kind of transmaterialist science of matter and mind, because we both really need it, as you say. It's not clear what matter is either.
No. I've been having a very interesting correspondence with Galen Strawson, who I quote obviously in this chapter a number of times, because I find what he says very convincing. He insists on a term, physicalism, which might lead people to think that he is simply saying the only reality is a sort of reduced material that has no aspect of consciousness about it. But what he's really saying is that material, the physical, already has in it something that doesn't need adding in or bringing in from somewhere else. Yes. And so there is not this split between matter and mind, which is really the position that I hold, though I find I express it in different terms.
Yes.
So when you get somebody like Patricia Churchland saying that, thought is identical with the action of the neurons in the brain as they function, what I call the twangling of neurons. He would say, well, yes, but after that we immediately completely diverge, Patricia Churchland and I, says Galen, because she sees anything other than simply the neurons in the most simple materialistic way as being everything. And it's exactly that he's trying to get away from. Because he's saying, yes, the mind for that moment and the action of the nerves are aspects of a single phenomenon.
Yes.
And really what one could say is that, maybe that's to rush ahead a bit, but that we're going to have to either do away with mind or matter. Some people say, I can't find either of these satisfactory. I mean, trying to do away with mind is the single most absurd suggestion ever made, because it's made using mind and can only be understood using mind. And the single fact that we can't deny is that we have mind, we have experience.
Yes.
I mean, as he says, trying to open up a gap between is and seems with experience is simply not possible, because to have what seems like experience is to have experience. So we have experience, whatever that is, and we can't take it out of the equation. And although we can actually argue to take matter out of the equation, I'd prefer not to, because once you start denying very fundamental aspects of experience, you come to this position that I've alerted us to before, that if you sufficiently deny the value of what we intuitively experience, you cut the floor from under science, because all science's theories are based on empirical observations and further reasoning on that basis. And if you reach a point where something as fundamental as matter is declared not to exist, or consciousness not to exist, then you're really making science impotent.
It's a kind of solution by mutilation that it's not feasible.
Yes,
and of course it can be made respectable, and I mean, it's not that we want to make because again the detail is also in the small font of these positions, but that's a kind of a drive. That's why I was insisting on this kind of patience that you have to go through all these broad stroke options and then look at it with microscope maybe. And so one would be that consciousness doesn't exist. We'll deal with this in a moment. Another one is you're saying, well, it's matter that doesn't exist. Then another one is, well, both exists, but they're distinct. And then both exist, but they're the same thing. And then very quickly, at least it sounds now natural to me after reading you for so many pages, well, probably they're distinct aspects, as you write, but of the same reality. And there's where we need to see how we articulate that intuition. But that seems now quite obvious to me, but it's not obvious. I mean, some people temperamentally, I don't know, maybe more inclined to option A, option B, option C.
Yes. Well, I suppose if to be rather predictable here, to mention the hemispheres, because they are relevant to everything, really. People with a predominantly left hemisphere dominated mindset, and most reductionist scientists and philosophers have really espoused this kind of mindset so long that they're not even aware of what they're not seeing. Then it's going to be either this or that, and they're going to be either one doesn't exist or the other doesn't exist. Or if they both exist, then they must be entirely distinct, or they must be the same. But actually there is another possibility, which is that they are different manifestations, different phenomena, but of the same underlying entity.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So let's go over those, but before the usual now, if we were in a room with more people, somebody would raise their hand and say, wait, Iain, how can we even talk about consciousness? You haven't defined it yet. So say something more, because you say something more at the beginning of the book, and it's.
Well, I mean, defining consciousness is maybe a rash step. I think there are a number of points to make. One is that that not just in the case of consciousness, but in the case of many things, that if your quest in philosophy is to understand it better, to define it at the outset is already to have put your thumb in the scales. Better is to see that you are approaching something which will become clearer as you approach it. And again, I like the image that I take from John Donne, the poet, of truth being a castle on a cragged mountain, and the way to get there is to go round, circling it. He that would seek truth about must go. So that would be my first point, is that if you start by defining it, then you're probably not going to find out much more about it, because you've already said what kind of a thing it is. However, let's say what we can at least apophatically say about consciousness as things as it is not. It is not simply the elements that we are now aware of. So I am at this moment aware of you, the screen, a couple of things in the periphery of my vision in this room, the top of the table, and so forth, maybe occasional peripheral sounds. But these are not what I mean by consciousness. I mean something much, much bigger, which is everything of which we have experience and that we take into account in the coming to an understanding of reality at every moment. And it's been rather amusingly estimated in a paper I quote that 99.44% of all that is going on in us that is part of cognition in the body, in the unconscious mind and so forth, is not present to consciousness at any one moment. Well, you don't have to buy the precision to get the idea that most of what we're doing is not necessarily what we mean by consciousness if we define consciousness as that which I am focally aware of at this moment. And what becomes clear when you understand the hemisphere hypothesis is what we're talking about when we talk about that is the attentional spotlight of the left hemisphere. So the image that I use to try and explain this is that the unconscious is not like a vast tank sort of living deep down in murky waters underneath this bright little area of consciousness, but that it's rather like a huge stage set where the spotlight is on one particular thing, and the other parts of the stage have not disappeared. They're perfectly real. They're just not at the moment illuminated by that spotlight. But this is a point that was first made as clearly as it is made by him, for me, by Julian Jaynes in his book on the origins of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And he points out just how extensive the aspects of what we are able to do without thinking about them consciously are. And this is something I explored a little bit in The Master and His Emissary, where I talked about the early Greek mind. And so effectively, it's not just that the unconscious is dealing with sort of murky things like dreams. It's also possible to be solving a difficult scientific or mathematical problem in the unconscious mind. Almost always this seems to be where those solutions are coming to us from. We can reason about things, we can weigh evidence, we can take decisions. In fact, most of our important decisions are arrived at through unconscious processing, although there will at times be explicit conversations. But so we can make complex decisions, we can weigh things, we can appreciate things, we can see the beauty of things, we can fall in love, we can make life-affecting decisions, we can weigh possible outcomes, we can weigh moral duties in order to see which way to act. All of this done unless we are disabled by our Western academic upbringing to such an extent that we can't imagine doing anything unless we've written it all out explicitly on paper. Yes. So all of this is going on in the unconscious mind, and it's extremely rich. And as we've had reason to comment on before, it's often better not to be conscious. There are situations in life, let me be very clear, where it's very important to be conscious, where things don't resolve and you can see a problem which needs a bit of unpicking, and there one's conscious attention is important. But as A.N. Whitehead said, civilizations advance by the number of activities that they can carry out without explicit consciousness. And he made this remark about conscious thought, which I think is lovely, that it's like cavalry charges in battle. It can only be made at decisive moments. It requires fresh horses, and one cannot be doing this except under very special circumstances. So that's right. The things that we are conscious of are usually where things are breaking down, and it's usually where the capacity of our unconscious mind to resolve things, which is doing it all the time, most of the time, 99% of the time, it's doing that job fine, and the bit that we're conscious of is where that process has run into the sand.
And to add one more derivative on it, and quoting you, you write, my whole embodied being, my experience, my history, my memory, my feelings, my personality, even, dare I say, my soul, psyche in the broadest sense. And a bit later, you write this expression, the field of me, which, by the way, later in the
Yes.
chapter, it will be even more than that, because you will discuss whether individual consciousness belongs to a wider mind in a way.
Yeah.
But it's all this, what you say, experientiality, right? All of
Yes.
these together.
That's right, and the emphasis is on the whole of me, including all my embodied knowledge and understanding, which contributes to my thinking, as we know. And I have earlier, I think, quoted the 18th century German philosopher and scientist Lichtenberg, who says we should say es denkt, it thinks, rather than I think. And so when one comes to the cogito, Descartes' cogito ergo sum, as people have often pointed out, he smuggles in an I, whereas all one is aware of, there is experience, there is thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't deny that in a certain sense it's perfectly reasonable to talk about me thinking. But since so much of it is not done by the person that I identify with as the bit I'm aware of and the bit that wills things consciously, it might be better to speak of things happening within the field of me. And that doesn't mean I'm disowning them in any way. It means I'm accepting them as part of me.
Yes. Yes. All right. So let's begin this stroll through the options. Let's begin with, if you might, resolve the problem by denying the existence of experience, which brings us to our friends, the illusionists, and also maybe the hallucinationists, if we could say that, like this whole camp of reasoning.
Yes, well, I suppose I've said what I can about that. It seems to me incoherent, to be honest, because the claim that it is an illusion requires something to be eluded. You can't have an illusion without consciousness or awareness. If you don't have any consciousness or awareness, there can be no illusion. So the illusion of there being an illusion, you go down a rabbit hole where you simply can't stop this process, because the very terms in which you're describing it imply that there is something that we are aware of. And if there is something that we are aware of, calling it illusory doesn't help. As I say, and it's a point made by Strawson, you can't, in this situation with experience, you cannot open up the is-seems gap, because if it seems to us that we have experience, we do have experience. That's what we mean by experience. If I see sunlight on a bowl of strawberries, then I see sunlight on the bowl of strawberries. Quite what it is, I may be mistaken. It may be an optical illusion. It may be a picture, and so on. But that's at a different, that's at a much lower level of the hierarchy. Nonetheless, there is an experience, and you can't get behind or beyond or away from that.
In a way, this position, as you just did, can be refuted perhaps in a sentence. But before I read a really harsh, probably accurate quote from Galen Strawson that I've prepared here, I wanted to ask you something maybe you are not expecting, which is, or we can do it together maybe, how to strawman this position of illusionism, because they're left hemisphere people, but they're certainly not stupid people, respectable and very intelligent. So, what's the best way in your mind to try to explain how they come to that conclusion and why they persist in maintaining it, despite it seems really, really stupid, I could say. But let's try to strawman it for a minute, maybe.
Okay. Well, you're absolutely right that, of course, I have every respect for the intelligence of people who take this position. It's just that I do believe it's incoherent, which is perfectly all right. I think the best way of thinking about it is this, that there are, of course, in the history of philosophy, a number of positions which depend on the idea that what we experience is a representation, not a presence. And if you are, and as we know, and we've explored that for 20 chapters, so I probably don't need to go there now again, it is the left hemisphere which takes whatever is present to the right hemisphere and represents it. And when it comes to reflect on its own representation, it wants to ask, well, how real is this representation that I've now made? Is this screen, is this diagram, is this theory that I have in front of me, is it correct or is it not? And of course, if you're in that frame of mind, it seems obvious that you can deny that this representation is of anything, if it is a representation. But what you can't get away from is the fact that before you've made your representations, before you've sat in your philosophy lab theorizing about this, you have experience. And a thing that Galen says at least once is, and it comes, I think, later on that I quote him, as saying that we should understand that before one has started philosophizing, one's understanding that experience is immediate is a perfectly respectable position to hold, and one that he does hold. Yes. Going back to Locke, he says to understand the taste of pineapple, tasting pineapple is both necessary and sufficient for being able to do that. And so really what he's saying is, let's get back to the fact, which is so quickly lost sight of in modern Western philosophy, that we do have experience. Now, I mean, we might go here, and I don't in the book, to thinking about, did we mention this before when we were talking, perhaps even last time we did a session, people who are, we didn't mention projection inside our heads.
Sorry, it broke. The connection broke there right when you were asking that. Could you say it again, please?
Oh, okay. Well, you know, and we may have discussed this before, that there are people, both psychologists and philosophers, who take the point of view that all that we experience is what they call a readout from a dashboard or a dial or something like that. So immediately a representation, not a direct contact with experience. But I also quote a number of philosophers and physicists who are very clear that this is to narrow the field, and that what we are experiencing can be represented, but what we actually experience is of something other than just ourselves. Now, that is essential to the whole project of my book, and is why, as I say, in the first dozen pages of the book, I try to avoid either the excesses of idealism or of naive realism, so that there is something real that exists apart from us, and we do contact it. It's just that our knowledge of it is imperfect.
Yes, thank you for that, and also for the kind of explanation of the train of thought that leads to illusionism. And now this comment you just made, yes, I think it brings us back to what we said at the very end of our previous conversation with respect to idealism, and which we'll come back when we discuss in a few minutes, maybe the denial of matter, and this analogy that's used by very respectable idealists like Bernardo Castro, the dashboard, like the physical world is this dashboard, and maybe I could say the perils, the what's at stake if you take that metaphor in order to justify idealism, which seems here the mirror image of illusionism, but now for matter. But let's not go. We can say more things, because we'll see that this chapter is like a novel, and at the end we'll see a resolution. It's not that you're not gonna put them on the same footing, but okay. So back to illusionism. I wanted to read this quote by Strawson, if you may. So you write, some philosophers, and here you quote Strawson, are prepared to deny the existence of experience. And then you quote him further. At this, we should stop and wonder. I think we should feel very sober and a little afraid at the power of human credulity, the capacity of human minds to be gripped by theory, by faith, for this particular denial is the strangest thing that has ever happened in the whole history of human thought, not just the whole history of philosophy. It falls, unfortunately, to philosophy, not religion, to reveal the deepest woo-woo of the human mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just to emphasize, those are Galen Strawson's words, not mine, but I endorse them. He says them very forcefully, which I probably wouldn't have, but I'm delighted he has, because I think the point is clear. And he also goes further and says, maybe we'll come on to that, but the idea that there is non-experiential reality is not something that has been demonstrated. In fact, he says the amount of evidence for there being non-experiential reality is mathematical and precise. It is exactly zero. All there is, he says somewhere, is one huge question-begging assumption, which is that we don't see certain aspects of the reality that we attend to, material objects, doing things that we do with our consciousness, so they must have no aspect of consciousness. But as he quite rightly says, there is no particle of evidence for that.
And this is the perfect segue to transition into the next option, let's put it this way, which is, well, let's not say it's an illusion, but let's hope it can be reduced to something else. And let's see how we reduce consciousness, how we account it. Here the verbs are also telling as to what's the project. You know, let's account, let's explain. And you could say explain away or simply explain. But but you're also critical of that attempt.
Is this? Are you asking me about the possibilities of emergence?
Yeah, so there comes emergence and evolution, all these ways to try to account for basically, yes, consciousness exists, but we'll be able to explain it with something that's more fundamental, or through other means we'll explain consciousness. Yes.
Well, I've already commented on the fact that matter is not more fundamental than consciousness, and is equally, I would say, a matter of debate what it is. So we're not retreating to something more certain, more sure, when we say that consciousness comes out of matter. But the whole business of emergence is, I think, misunderstood. For example, there are emergent properties, and some people refer to, for example, water, its fluidity, its liquid properties, of which we're sensible, that we can sense, somehow emerge from molecules of H2O moving across one another. But here again, Strawson points out that we're talking here about something different, because when you look at molecules of H2O, there are elements in them that can, on their own, give an explanation of why, at a higher level, these phenomena should emerge. But the point he makes is that for any element that is said to emerge from some other element, there must be something about that first element that is in that element and alone explains the later arising of something from it. It's not good enough just to say, well, it does arise, and do a kind of rapid passage of the hands and go, and now a miracle occurs. Because for consciousness to arise out of matter, if you understand matter as purely devoid of consciousness, is an impossibility. There is nothing about the existence of consciousness, if, as I say, you insist that it has nothing of matter in it, that can explain the arising of consciousness. But of course, if you already start with the idea that there's some kind of matter in consciousness, then of course you don't have that problem. And that actually is the position that I take, that matter and consciousness are not so distinct, that there is no consciousness within matter, and so we don't have this problem. But I also make the point that, which I think is not often enough thought about, that this miracle, if it is a miracle that's going to happen, where, according to some people, consciousness is going to emerge from wholly unconscious matter. This has got to happen not just once in the history of evolution, but every single time a creature is born, because it starts apparently in a couple of cells that come together. Now, if you deny those cells consciousness, then where in this process is there going to be consciousness? Because the baby, when it's born, undoubtedly does have consciousness. Yes. So somewhere along the line, must be constantly happening. Mm-hmm. If you deny that it is, then of course you're back to the fact that cells are conscious already. Now that's a step forward. And there is a lot of evidence, some of which I go into in this chapter, that cells are conscious. Mm. But it's not just cells, I believe, that are conscious. It's that matter is impregnated with consciousness in some form. Mm. Or, to put it better, consciousness and matter are just different ways of exhibiting phenomena of the same underlying ontological entity. And it's probably worth saying here that matter is an abstraction that nobody has ever seen. Mm. Matter is better expressed as material qualities which we attribute to many things in our experience. Mm. So there are elements in our experience that we call material, and we lump them together and call them matter, although, as I say, nobody's ever just seen pure matter. Mm. But although I know that matter is something I can come to know only because I have experience, I don't know that consciousness is something I can experience only because of matter. Mm. That might be true. I argue that it isn't true, but it's got more going for it, this idea that matter is something that I need consciousness to have any knowledge of at all, then that matter is something that is necessary for me to have consciousness at all. Mm.
Let me dwell here a little bit, and also we'll try to strawman it. Let me dwell a bit, because I think it's important. It's also a province that's inhabited by many major neuroscientists believing in what emergence can do. And of course, I've critiqued, like you, promissory materialism. And for that mantra, impossible is nothing, in the sense that, well, if you say, here we have consciousness, this is our beast to tame in the lab or in the whiteboard, we'll certainly do it. I mean, there's some resistance of probably it's the intellect, maybe the left brain, but whatever. It's like, no way, I'm not going to renounce to the possibility of doing what we do as scientists with phenomena, which is explain them, right? Now, you mentioned matter, and it's become very clear that those who invoke matter, probably they don't know what matter really is. It's as mysterious, but there are other ways. So there's some arguments could be summarized as, well, as with life, so with mind and consciousness, meaning, and they caricaturize, okay, we used to believe in phlogiston, we used to believe in the élan vital. We've talked about the élan vital, right, and this 12-year-old understanding of it, but in any case, the idea as, well, as with life, so with mind, and maybe it's not matter, maybe it's information, maybe it's predictive processing, but in any case, complexity science takes emergence seriously. And sure, even if it's one miracle, maybe we have billions of miracles daily in organisms, but still, let's strawman this. There is the big conviction, and I think they believe it, that one way or another we'll find a way to account for it, to explain consciousness. We may not know with what, probably it's not matter, but with something else. Just give us enough time and money and we'll figure it out.
Yes. Well, of course, it's wonderfully extravagant not to take into account, well, maybe one of the possibilities which would resolve this is that consciousness is a primary entity in the universe. It is an ontological primitive. That is a wonderfully parsimonious explanation. There seems to be a war on the idea of consciousness that there is no equivalent of in the case of matter. They don't have a war on matter. Well, surely sooner or later we will be able to explain matter as arising out of consciousness. They have a war on consciousness. Sooner or later we'll explain it as arising out of matter. Unless, by information, what one is talking about is something that we that is neither conscious nor material. Then you've got several problems to show how both consciousness and material arise out of information. And then we need to know what you mean by information, because, of course, the root of the word information is the idea of form. And it may very well be coherent to say that everything that exists in the cosmos that we can use physics to know, the physical cosmos, is in the form of a field of form. And so information may be of this kind. The trouble is that the word information is a very treacherous one, and I prefer not to use it because it suggests long streams of ones and zeros that can be fed into a computer. And of course, that's not at all what can be meant here.
Yes, and we could say more about that, but probably that's enough. And I see that there's this war on consciousness. Maybe it's too a bit exaggerated, but I'm surprised when I've read the latest books by Antonio Damasio, for instance. I mean, let's not speak about Churchland, but some people are extremely opposed to it's like allergic to the core. It's you can see that they're calm, they're explaining their thing, their view, and then when it comes the section to dismiss panpsychism, or the idea that mind may pervade the universe, there is this outflow of emotion, negative emotion, and that's very interesting from a maybe psychological point of view. What's going on there, and to be so annoyed by just the possibility that this is a viable route.
Yes, no, I know. Well, as I say, I think it's built in from an early age to early assumptions are made that are never questioned. And so by the time you come to being somebody famous in your field of research, you're not going to revise radically those assumptions. First of all, there'll be a high cost to it. People will think you've lost the plot, and you may be just at the point where you're about to win a prize, and people will say, oh, not to win it.
But let's take another point that they mentioned seriously, because at least it's difficult in my mind. And we're going... some people may think we're going fast covering this, but we're going also slowly. There are many things to talk about yet. But let's talk about evolution. And the argument, like the evolutionary argument, which in a way clashes with the more phenomenological one, which is perhaps the one we're preferring here, is, well, yes, we may be conscious here now, whatever that means. Rewind the tape and rewind it whenever you feel comfortable, before humans, before life on Earth, and before animals. But certainly there'll be a point when the volume may have gone down. So if now we know through science that there was a point in time in the universe where there wasn't life and so on, it must have emerged. I mean, what other option? And we know what other option there is. Well, it was there all along in a subtle way we still need to articulate. But this evolutionary argument, which is, by the way, also a beautiful tale when you read these popular science books, when they start explaining how this complexification of life and mind, I don't think that's wrong, but there's something there that clashes completely with the idea that this cannot happen. I mean, it seems like at some point, it seems like a magic trick. Beautiful evolutionary story, but where and how did the magic occur?
Well, I don't think they're parallels, the proposed or supposed emergence of consciousness from matter and the emergence of life. I don't think they're parallels. I think the emergence of life is entirely satisfactory. I don't think there needs to be any special little thing added in. I think that life is distinct from inanimacy, but and this is not really the point at which to make this argument, though I could do when we come to talk about one of the following chapters. I take the view that Robert Rosen took, that inanimacy is the limit case of life. Not that animacy is some weird thing that pops up who knows where from. And that has nothing to do with the idea that life may be rare in the cosmos. I don't know whether it's rare or not. Nobody does. But even if it were, it's really not, that is not the same point that I'm making. It's not that one may be commoner than the other. It's that the features of animacy are there, but in a very, very much reduced form in what we call the inanimate world. And what I believe life brings is two things: a billionfold or more speeding up of responsiveness to the cosmos. So inanimate structures, molecules of iron ore or whatever respond to the world, but they respond very much slower. And what life brings is far greater speed, far greater complexity, and a far greater range of responsiveness. So it responds to many other features of the cosmos, which are the ones I will describe in chapters 26 and 27. And are, for me, why life comes about. So the discussion about life has nothing to do, in my view, with the discussion about the emergence of consciousness. The emergence of consciousness from unconscious matter, if it has a parallel, is like the emergence from non-being, not like the emergence from life from non-life. So as we don't need to go into, the idea of being suddenly emerging out of non-being is a very, very odd idea, and it can't emerge gradually. There can't be just a little bit of being. Once there's being, full stop. And if there isn't being, there is nothing to be. So going back to the problem of the emergence or otherwise of consciousness from consciousness from matter that has no consciousness. It seems to me an impossibility, and panpsychism seems to me a far better alternative, one that was embraced for hundreds of years by mainstream philosophers and in the East and West.
Yeah, well, thank you for that distinction again. Like not use life as a template to think about the problem, but use being as. So this immediately brings two questions, and before we continue, so then this means that there cannot be being without consciousness. Are you saying something like that? This is already making a very strong philosophical point, right? Because how else to conceive of being with and or without consciousness?
So being underwrites absolutely everything, but everything that we know in this universe must partake of consciousness or be in consciousness in some form.
Yeah, I want to insist on that, because that's really a hard topic, to say the least, that would divert us. But if you allow me, let me just again one little step back. So okay, many people argue that, well, first that there may be this mind and life continuum, and if there isn't, well, once life emerges, and just said you'll be comfortable with that statement, once it emerges, then of course there are these rudiments of cognition that get complexified, and then at some point in this unfurling, mentality emerges and consciousness emerges. And these are different words, but I want to insist that it's a very strongly and popularly held view that, well, life is like this little horse that can start to, carry this molding idea of cognition, then stretching out into mentality and ultimately into consciousness. So where's the fallacy there, in your view?
There isn't a fallacy, I don't think, and I don't see that I need to hold that there is. Correct me if I'm wrong. But what I would say is, yes, that life enables consciousness to become more conscious. So, and I would say, but this is not necessary for anyone to agree with me about, we'll talk about it in chapter 27, is that this may explain why there is life at all, that it is to enable greater responsiveness. See, I believe that the cosmos is fundamentally conscious and resonant, i.e. what exists are relationships between elements in it, and those relationships are those are what actually fundamentally exists. The things that we call things emerge from that complex of relationships. Now, if that complex of relationships depends on a resonance whereby things become better known, the cosmos comes to understand itself through its own constant creativity. This is my belief. Then that would explain, but as I say, it's not necessary for my argument here at the moment to say explain why there is life, but let us just put it this way. When life begins, what we call life, and we don't need to dispute what that is, it's when RNA starts to exist and so on. What happens is very rapid, relatively speaking, complexification and responsiveness. So the process of becoming more complex and becoming more responsive, which would be, according to me, the purposes of the universe, to become more complexly beautiful, to unfold, to allow what is implicate to become explicate.
Yes.
If that is the case, then that whole agenda is taken very much further forward by life and by human consciousness. So I believe that, certainly living things have consciousness, that even living cells have consciousness, but there are hierarchies of consciousness. There is degrees of complexity, degrees of responsiveness, if you like to put it that way. And that the human, what is special about human consciousness, and which may be one of the reasons for regretting that we may well exterminate ourselves, although I imagine, given time, something perhaps better equipped to do this process will come along. Is one of the reasons to regret our possible extinction is that we, above all creatures, are able to respond to this complex cosmos. I think. Yeah. I mean, we can't ever know anything about. Well, not know anything, but we can't. We're always making suppositions about other creatures' consciousnesses. And one thing that at least has made progress in my lifetime is that we now see that all living creatures, probably most people would now say, have a degree of consciousness at least. So the battle is being won, because as I point out in the book, back in the 70s, it was common practice in America and the West to operate on babies less than a year old without using an anesthetic because they had no consciousness, apparently. Yeah. And I was deeply shocked when I heard that, but it is quite clear.
Fine. So then we reach to panpsychism, and I wanted to ask you about a strand of panpsychism, which I see as a kind of conservative revolution, but conservative within the neuroscientists, which is the form that preaches that consciousness is a fundamental property of matter, in a way. That seems to be kind of a vanilla form of panpsychism. Maybe one that's pushing in the right direction, but maybe not pushing too hard so that it doesn't break. I suppose we embrace a harder, more not a vanilla, a strongest version of it. But that could be like a beginning of asking permission to consider.
Well, yes, I know. I mean, in a way, it's very encouraging. One sees science constantly moving closer and closer to a point of view that I'm actually putting forward. First, we allow that there may be consciousness in other beings than human beings, and we allow that consciousness may actually be in things. Then we say, well, maybe consciousness is a property of matter, and we're not too far from the position I would take, which is that matter is a property of consciousness.
Yes.
And that consciousness, we don't even have to fall out over this, because I would be prepared to say, in a way, an argument about whether consciousness or matter is primary. I think there are arguments that it is ontologically primary to matter. And as I say, we all we know about matter is that it's something that we experience through our consciousness. It's an element of things that we are aware of in our consciousness. But it's possible to say that the situation is like that of water. That water that we definitely talked about in our last discussion water can manifest in different ways. It can manifest as a liquid that is translucent and that can flow over your hand. It can manifest as a lump of something utterly opaque, very, very cold and hard enough to split your head open. It can be so diffused in the atmosphere around you that you don't see it at all and are not aware of it, that you die without it. So which of these actually is water? Well, some people would say, well, water is the flowing one, and the others are versions of water. But we don't have to say that. We can just say that whatever it is that we call water can manifest in different ways, sometimes as ice, sometimes as water vapor. So when people say, well, matter doesn't look like consciousness, I'd say, well, ice doesn't look like water. And, the water in the atmosphere doesn't look like the stream outside my house. But they are effectively all the same thing manifesting in different ways. Now, I don't know of a better way to express certainly what I can see as a viable option for our understanding the relationship between matter and consciousness.
Yes, indeed. And you add something
but
more on it.
Push me on it. I'd be happy to be pushed.
I like that we transition from allowing consciousness to be a very, very important fundamental guest to say, well, maybe it's more like a host. and then matter is somebody living in that house. But that's where I now, after having covered all the different versions, we get into what you really think about what consciousness may be, and you add to this metaphor of the phase of water that matter provides the necessary resistance for creation.
Yes, exactly.
That's very McGilchristian, or however it's said, right? Like we've seen this throughout the book, and so let's now get into that, and also how this bipolar understanding of matter and consciousness comes about in your thinking.
Maybe rather than bipolar, which is what I heard, you were talking about what I call dipolar, i.e. the way in which two things like the North Pole and South Pole of a magnet, one cannot exist without the other existing. They are absolutely distinct. I mean, that they have different properties, but they exist in the same place, and there is no hard and fast point at which you say, well, this is where the North Pole becomes the South Pole. So if it's that you're saying, then of course that is a lovely way of putting what I believe to be the relationship between matter and consciousness, that they are a pair, if you like, that call on one another and increase potential for one another. And the way they do it is by matter offering resistance. And Schopenhauer, who we have had occasion to quote before, says that matter is what endures. And so what he's drawing attention to is a slowing down of the process of flow caused by matter. Now, if everything is flowing, ice actually is flowing, even though it doesn't seem to be, like the mountain behind my house is flowing. But it's flowing very, very much more slowly than the river. So nothing lasts forever, but some things last longer. And by lasting for longer, they enable certain other things to gather around them and to grow. So resistance to a process is very important. And when we talked about flow, I talked about this idea that the resistance to the flow is not something, it can be added, but it is not necessarily something that has to be added to the flow as a contrary element put into the flow, but can arise out of the flowing process itself and impede the flowing process in order that something within the flow comes into being. And when I say within the flow, to repeat, I'm not talking about something separate in the flow, but a form that the flow takes for the while that vertex, that whirlpool, that eddy, whatever one likes to call it, exists. So what matter is not distinct from the flow of consciousness. It's elements in consciousness that for a while give us the possibility of endurance, relative permanence. And the other thing is that this is not just about endurance in time. It's about offering a contrary motion, if you like, that can give, or even a frustration to motion that can give rise to things. So I take the view, like almost all the pre-Socratic philosophers, certainly like Heraclitus, Empedocles and Anaximander, that the coming together of opposites is an extraordinarily important element in the existence of things, and we talked about a whole chapter I devote to that topic, chapter 20. Here the simplest way to put, again, I'm sorry if I repeat myself, but somebody may be looking at this episode on its own and may not have seen the others. But I make the point that, it's a very simple one, can be made very quickly, that friction is what stops motion, but it's also what enables motion. Without friction, we could never move. But with too much friction, we can't move either. So an element of friction is important. Now, all one can say about matter is that matter can't be an aspect of all of our consciousness, but without it being an aspect of some of our consciousness, which I believe is the case, our consciousness would not have the leverage that it has on both becoming and understanding. Now those are deeply what I believe life is for.
That's actually beautiful, and my mistake in saying bipole when I should have said dipole also helps us understand how nuanced all that is. And so thank you for thank you for correcting it and explaining this interplay, which, by the way, conceptually, it can be attempted through what you quote here also, and you explain the Bohr's principle of complementarity. You talk about it, you talk about how valuable that is for physics, and the attempt to extend it beyond physics, and how that very principle can help us really understand this image of this reciprocal kind of increasing of potential between apparent opposites.
Absolutely. It's at the core of things, as Bohr pointed out. Contraria sunt complementa was the motto that he adopted when he was ennobled by the Danish crown. And which means that contraries complement one another. And it's an idea, actually, that it's in Nietzsche, that these two forces that he calls the Apollonian and the Dionysian, by striving with one another, bring forth ever greater life and ever greater efforts, ever greater achievements.
And I was making that's a bit stupid, but I was making a list of principles, because as a physicist who has transitioned to biology and the life and mind sciences, I'm always wondering, well, what principles do we have here to conceive all that, not just metaphors or effective models. And so, well, so far and they're relevant, like the principle of complementarity, but then you also speak about reciprocity, and there's incompleteness and there's uncertainty. So I just wanted to mention all of these, because when you hear all of those together, you realize it's a different type of harmony that can invoke the music analogy altogether. We're talking about the life, the universe, and everything in another key. I don't know if it's a minor key, but it's another key. And the fact that you remind us of those important concepts is very helpful to create this tone of thinking that we need to understand in these difficult times.
Yes. You reminded me of Susanne Langer there for a moment. But anyway, yes. And I think that's right, that these images of a world that is uncertain, that is reciprocal, that is profoundly dependent on context and so on, just that once again, when one takes into account what physicists say about the relationship between matter and consciousness and the conscious cosmos, there are just so many people, physicists, who have in their time put the point. Planck said, that I have no doubt that consciousness is fundamental. There is nothing more fundamental than consciousness. Materiality is an aspect of consciousness. And that is repeated so many times. It's extremely impressive, because I repeat pretty much every great mind in physics in the last 100 years making this point. So if that is the case, then once again, the right hemisphere's idea of the world that it is profoundly interconnected, that it is never finally pinnable down, it's not actually certain, that it is reciprocal, that it is contextually to be understood. All of these validate the right hemisphere's take on things by comparison with that of the left.
And I know we're running longer than usual. We could have expected that, and we have more things to cover. But I wanted to ask you about, it may sound as a curiosity, but let's see if it's more than that. You have this note about Wikipedia quote on Max Planck, and whether a quote was there and was. How should I understand that? Is that there was deliberately an attempt to not say all that Planck was saying?
No, I wouldn't like to attribute any motive, but I thought it was interesting because it's been very often commented that there is a group of editors who seem extremely motivated towards reductionist materialism and write extremely tendentious remarks about elements in science that they don't happen to agree with. So that is true. But I just thought it's rather odd that in the WikiQuote page there isn't this. And I have, so I looked up the talk about it, and it said that an editor had found it attributed to Planck in a certain interview that was conducted in 1931, and that the person had looked up the record of this interview and had found that it was not right. And I have this dirty little habit of looking up references to see if they really say what people say. And I have to tell you, it is remarkable that so many times when I've done that, I found that the reference, which may have been quoted many times, repeated in the literature, doesn't say what it was said to say. But anyway, let's leave that aside. And I'm certainly not saying that I've never misunderstood something myself. But when I went there and found it was there exactly verbatim where it had been said not to be. So I said, well, I'm afraid I've reinstated it. And I'm glad to say I looked at it just the other day because probably of this talk. Not only is it still on the WikiQuote page, but it is now underneath the picture of Planck as his primary saying. So thank you, Wikipedia. I'm glad that Wikipedia can learn. That's very good.
Oh, so it has a happy ending. Good.
It has a happy ending, this story. Yes.
Well, because there's much to talk, but sociologically, there are forces that dominate, and some of these things have happened in Wikipedia. But in any case, it's good that we have Wikipedia as well to check things.
It is very good that we have it.
Yes.
But there is no organisation, let alone one so imaginative and brave, really, that will not have its points that need improving. I don't think it's too much to say. There are things about Wikipedia that really need addressing, and one of them is their attitude to any kind of non-mainstream position in science.
Yes.
Because actually, after all, if you love science, you don't want it to be fossilized. You want it to move on. And it's moving on. And I'm afraid we need to take account of that and not write dismissive things about people who are highly intelligent, have things to say that may not fit with the current paradigm. Yeah,
like to share a brief anecdote of mine. I'm studying certain phenomena with Rupert Sheldrake, as you know, and I commented this to one of my students. And then he came the other day and said, well, the next day or a few days later, look, I checked that in Wikipedia and it says this and that and that. What's wrong with it? And it's like, okay, maybe I can also give you my version. But, it can be problematic because people are not going to buy a book on that topic. They're just going to type it in Google, Wiki, and then the topic. And, they're going to get a picture. And because we all have so little time, that's the impression they're going to get about certain phenomena. But anyway.
Well, that's the trouble, and interesting. There is a whole book on the distortion and banning of Sheldrake, both from TED talks and on Wikipedia. His dissing on Wikipedia, called The Psi Wars, and I just finished reading it. It's a recommendable book, and it goes into it in some detail. I've been Rupert's page lately, but I believe that it's begun to change as well. It started to become less resistant and less confrontational and dismissive.
That's what we need. I'm so glad to hear. Okay.
Yes,
So
well, evolution, it's what we want, isn't it? Mm.
So with this brief interlude, so let's continue with the chapter. And so you ask, well, so because we can talk about brains, but are neurons necessary? And that's a very important question, right? And then you write about certain, like, is it the hydrocephalia cases, right? The very thing, hydrocephalia, how is that pronounced?
Oh, yeah, yes, yes. Well, yes, I talk about people with hydranencephaly. Now, there's a thing called hydrocephalus, which means having too much cerebrospinal fluid inside the cranium, and it takes up space in ventricles which are part of the normal brain, but they're expanded to the expense of the volume of cortex. And I describe somebody there who's not quite hydranencephalic, who managed to get a maths degree, a first-class maths degree from Leeds University, had an IQ of 126, and was socially and emotionally normal on interview, but had very little brain. I mean, he had just a few millimeters of a rim of cortex, or centimeter at least anyway, of cortex, but not the normal volume. And that case was just one of many, as it turns out, that are in the literature. And then I refer to subjects who actually have hydranencephaly. And there's a thing called anencephaly, where there simply is no brain. And hydranencephaly is very similar. But it's compatible with life, rarely. And these people have effectively a cranium that is filled with fluid, and above the brainstem there is almost nothing. And there's a study of 4 individuals aged between 5 and 17, I think. And it's remarkable what they can do. They can recognize different people. They can respond emotionally and appropriately to them. They can have favorite toys. They can play music. One of the 4 could pass the mirror test, could recognize their own reflection in a mirror, which it was thought that human children couldn't do when they're very young, and possibly couldn't do if they were autistic. I mean, although that's no longer believed at all. And now we know that there are various animals that can do this, but quite a few. But in any case, there we are. These figures were able to achieve quite extraordinary levels of function, not just cognitive, but social and emotional, but also cognitive function, without effectively having any brain at all. So the idea that whatever it is emerges out of the massive complexity of the brain, simply the sheer number of neurons, can't be right on that basis alone. But it's also worth mentioning in this context that the cerebrum, the new brain, the part of the brain that most people think of when they visualize their brain, although it takes up most of the space in the skull, only has a fifth, 20% of the neurons. The other 80% of the neurons, 4 times as many neurons, are in the cerebellum, the so-called ancient brain at the base, the posterior part of our brain. And yet, and it also contains some of the most complexly interconnected and ramified neurons in the brain. Nonetheless, is not capable, however complex, of sustaining consciousness. Yeah. It's also not necessary for life, again, so that there are cases, I think I tracked down all 14 that I could find in the literature, often diagnosed at post-mortem, when the person had led an apparently reasonably normal life. I mean, not completely normal, of course, but a reasonably normal life.
Yeah. I mean, this casts all these asterisks on very quick interpretations about necessity and sufficiency of brain areas for holding, or they would say producing consciousness, because while it may be necessary in the sense that if you knocked it down, then the whole thing disappears. But then if you leave enough time, it may recover function somewhere else, or you may find cases where there are no neurons at all, arguably, like when you discuss also slime molds and plants, where probably it's quite likely that some other forms of mind are also taking place.
Yes. I mean, one interesting issue, there's just so much to talk about, isn't there? But one interesting thing is the point made by F.X.C. Schiller, the late 19th century Oxford philosopher, which we all know about, but isn't sufficiently considered, which is how is it that when a part of the brain is damaged or destroyed, the brain as a whole seems to know that this function needs to be expressed somewhere, and it finds somewhere else to be expressed. I mean, it's an interesting question, but shall we move on to talking about creatures that definitely have no neurons?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that I started out by being excited about was slime mold, because slime mold is a pretty basic kind of organism, but it turns out that people researching on slime molds have to fasten the lids of the cultures at night, or the slime molds will escape and explore the lab. And far more than that, they can be trained to solve mazes in the way that rats can. And interestingly, you can cut a piece off of a slime mold and it becomes another slime mold in its own right. And if you cut off a part, just a small part of the slime mold that has once learnt how to solve the maze, the piece that's cut off also knows how to solve the same maze. So it has memory in some form, although of course it has no neurons whatever. And then of course we come on to the complex memories of plants, which is another extraordinary thing that is just not widely enough known. I think it may be becoming more known through things like Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, but still.
Yeah, that's more for the fungi side of it. But yeah, there are these plant wars going on. Some people decide to call it plant neurobiology, probably to piss off neurobiologists, but also to make the point that non-neural organisms should be respectable, at least in principle, when we're studying their functions. Now, we're talking here about problem solving and types of memory, and that's very important indeed, to be able to empirically demonstrate whether a plant can do operant conditioning, rather than habituation. And I know that there's some work, but it's under replication, let's put it this way. But in any case, this would be evidence for intelligence, aspects of cognition, intelligence, memory, but not yet awareness, right?
It depends what you mean by awareness. And of course, awareness is something that we know what it is, but without getting into another being, which is obviously an impossibility, we can't be sure what awareness is. We can only look for the signs of it. And I suppose that if you are able to assess your environment intelligently and respond to it, including to stimuli that you could not have either experienced as an individual or as a species, and therefore be prepared for by any inherited phenomenon. If you are able to nonetheless make intelligent decisions for the first time, and you're highly responsive, it seems to me it's difficult to maintain that there is no awareness there.
Yes.
Go on.
No, please continue. Your thought.
Well, I just wondered if it was worth demonstrating what one means here by reference to a few fairly robust findings. I mean, one, of course, just relates to the individual cell or to single-celled organisms. Or to very simple creatures like flies. But then in every case, we can show that even a single cell can respond to an injury inflicted on it mechanically in a way which is intelligent, which uses resources in an intelligent way to heal itself, that it would not have been programmed for. And it was finding that this went on in fairly simple aspects of biology that gave Barbara McClintock a Nobel Prize in the 1980s.
Yeah.
But the thing that when we come to plants, it's worth mentioning just en passant that Darwin's last written work was on the roots of plants, and that they carry out what he called circumnutation, with an N for November in the middle there, circumnutation, which is a circular motion whereby they explore the environment and find the right way to go. And he says it is not too much to call the roots of a plant the brain of it. And if one understands the way a brain in an animal works, one cannot help seeing that the root system of a plant acts in a similar way to what we think of as intelligent response. But the experiment I particularly like is the one about the pea plants, you know, where Monica Galliano, I think, and I believe this has been replicated, grew pea plants that were starved of light in controlled conditions in which they were under a Y-shaped structure that would allow light to come down one or other arms of the Y shape, but which arm it was would be randomly selected. So the plant couldn't know that it was always going to be the left-hand one or the right-hand one. But there was a clue, which was that sometime before the light came on, a puff of air came down that particular arm. Now, since it was in the plant's best interest to make the most use of the light, it was obviously incumbent on the plant to grow towards that light as soon as it could. And it knew that when this puff of air came, it could grow towards the one that would later produce the light. And that's not something that it could have known from experience, or could have, or it can know from its own experience in the lab, as it were, but it can't be programmed for that. It was an intelligent understanding. And in case people say, oh, well, there is a connection in nature between a puff of air and the light, she did the control experiment in which the puff of air came down the other arm, down which the light wouldn't come, and the plants in that setting still managed to select the right plant to grow toward. So the right tube of the structure to grow toward. So I think that is an example of responsive intelligence.
Yes, indeed, and trying to or showing that plants can have associative learning is a breakthrough in a way. Pavlov's dogs. Here we're talking about Gagliano's peas, right? And I'm just saying, as you're saying that, I follow that, and I know it's controversial, but it's controversial on many levels. It's controversial because of the name of the field. It's controversial because of the very result, and also it's difficult to replicate in the lab because, as some scientists should, but we know what skepticism can do. You should try to find flaws in the experiment just to make it robust and replicate it, but you can also try to find flaws because it doesn't go with your own worldview.
All of that is perfectly reasonable.
Yes, that's happening right here, right now, as we speak. There are these frictions, but sure, I think the trend is clear. Over the last decades and many years, there have been, I'm sorry for the bureaucratic metaphor, there have been more boxes ticked as to, okay, we used to believe only adult humans can do all of those things well. Babies can, well, rodents may, well, fruit flies too, now plants, and maybe the slime mold. So there are all these ticks now as to this family, this constellation of cognitive abilities, you could say, that we used to think they would only belong to humans.
Yes, it's worth making just 2 points on passant. One is that on the neurobiology of plants, that, as you undoubtedly know, some of the same neurotransmitters that are active in the brain are active in plant communication. So that is interesting. Just en passant, I'm not setting a huge amount of store by it, but it may be one of the reasons that it's not quite unreasonable to talk about such things. But the other is just that creatures that we've rather passed over, like crows that have very tiny brains, although they have very densely packed brains, but have no neocortex, they're nonetheless able to solve problems that even a 9 or 10-year-old child might find difficult. They can solve problems that many humans can find difficult. They can recognize and show an appropriate response to an individual human face several years after a single insects like spiders and bees can solve simple arithmetic. There's an awful lot going on there that we, have tended to gloss over because it couldn't be. All that worries me about these, the responses of people is not to dismiss things. Yes, take them seriously, see if they work. If they do, then we've made a step forward. If they constantly are impossible to replicate, then we need to rethink.
Yes, my own position here is a bit more tempered than usual, because they can certainly be, but it doesn't mean they must be. But in any case, there are amazing books coming out, popular science books about the mind of a bee by Lars Chipka, or also the Book of Minds by Philip Bolt. So, we're doing this stretching on the zeitgeist, perhaps we can conceive, because there's data indicating that all that minds are, well, maybe not pervasive to the universe as panpsychists we would like, but at least pervasive in the animal kingdom for sure, and maybe in life writ large.
Yes.
Now, in your chapter, to comment on other very interesting things you write about, back to the human mind, you write about placebo, hypnosis, and you even dare to write the P word, paranormal, and just mention that there's some studies out there about all these fringes, we could call it, or edges of the human mind, and well, they deserve to be studied, not just dismissed.
Yes, I deliberately don't go into the paranormal for two reasons. One is that otherwise reasonable people, there seems a red mist descends on them when they're confronted with the paranormal, and so it's not really worth the candle. But the other is that I don't know enough about it, and I really think that one would have to know an awful lot about it to be able to speak about it in a measured and balanced way. But it's enough to say that there is nothing controversial about the fact that placebos work, and that things like cognitive behavioral therapy can change the chemicals in the brain and the way the brain even grows. So all I really mention those things to make clear and hypnosis is to make clear that the mind can have an effect on matter. It obviously can, but it's just worth stating that the mind can affect the brain and the brain can affect the mind. There's a two-way intercourse there. That's the point there.
And in my opinion, there's very serious work and continued work by Dean Radin and Edsel Cardeña and many others who you cite in these lovely notes, side to the page. And I would encourage the readers that are curious to just go and check the proper science that's being done on these matters. And by the way, they nicely not square the circle, but go back in circles to where we started, because they suggest a permissive function of the brain. So after all, and maybe that's a way to start wrapping up, you ask, well, are neurons necessary? And we've discussed this. And then you ask, well, so why brains at all? Or what is consciousness for? So maybe we could discuss these very important questions you pose at the end. But this, the plants, the slime molds, this terminal lucidity, all these phenomena, in a way, when you zoom out, they seem pretty coherent with the permissive theory of brain function.
Yes, and a couple of things to mention. Bernardo Kastrup, I suppose, he reports a case study of somebody with multiple personalities, and several of the alters, the personalities, were blind. And when those alters were expressed, the EEG recorded no activity in the parts of, the optic cortex. So this is remarkable in itself. And then there's the phenomenon of so-called terminal lucidity, of which there are countless reports of, as it were, yes, it's true that when the brain begins to fail, certain things in the phenomenological world start to disappear. But when the brain is finally coming to the end of its existence. So usually within the last 24 hours, and it does seem to be limited certainly to the last few days, but usually to the last 24 hours of life, people suddenly have a kind of lucidity. People who've never spoken for years suddenly are able to speak articulately, and so forth, which seems to suggest that the disappearance of the brain here, the switching off of the brain, allows aspects of consciousness to come forward. This would be perfectly in keeping with the studies that have been done on near-death experiences, where, again, the electrophysiological measures show there should be no cerebral activity. But people don't just describe a kind of delirium or a sort of fog of ideas, chaos. They describe extremely clear ideas, that being clearer than normal, and having experiences that are both beautiful and profound. So there's certainly something there that, again, is worth taking into account. But I suppose another would be the experiments which I remember reading about when I was about 20, that were done by Wilder Penfield under surgery when the brain was open at operation, that with the patient conscious, because touching the brain with an electrode causes no pain at all. It's completely painless, the brain. And he was able to stimulate areas in the brain and have completely distinct phenomena described, which were memories of these people. And so again, what seems to be happening is the brain is storing but filtering experience. And this was a point that was made by Bergson 100 years and more ago, that the brain was related to memory, but its function was of filtering it, enabling only the things that are of importance to us to be available at the time. And one can see that if one has a mass of information, one does need to be selective about what is available at any one moment. And I suggest, in short, that when we ask the question, since all the without what we think of as our consciousness, why do we have this consciousness at all? And so the question is always, so what is it that consciousness does for us? What is the purpose of consciousness for us? And there's an argument, which is not uncommonly put, that since we can do so much unconsciously, we don't really need consciousness. But I put the question the other way around, because if I'm right that consciousness is an ontological primitive, and that obviously the mental features that we distinguish, like our ability to understand, to think, and so on, are present, then consciousness is an intelligent entity, and we are to the purposes of consciousness, rather than consciousness being to our purposes. And that is to say that what we do is to be able to do things that other creatures with perhaps less been able to do. For example, to create all these beautiful things that we see in the world. Beautiful mathematical solutions, beautiful moves in chess, beautiful sonatas and songs by Schubert, wonderful, the beauty of a mountain, which is of no interest in itself to an animal for its survival, but we see it. The beautiful shape of a tree. I mean, the tree may give off signals to insects which are in its interest and in the insect's interest, but the overall extraordinary beauty of shape of an oak tree is something that no creature needs to experience, but we do. And it helps to answer the otherwise imponderable question: if the whole point about evolution is greater survival, the most robust survivors and the longest survivors are very ancient. There are things like actinobacteria that live at enormous depths in the ocean, single examples of which may be over 1 million years old. So they have both shown that their evolution has lasted, they've not needed to do anything else, and the single examples are enormously long-lived. And as you get more complex, through trees that may live for hundreds of years, you come to poor old humans that may only live for 70 years. And why is that a success? The answer is not to do with survival. It's to do with resonance, relationship, reciprocity, reverberation, all these rewords, because we are taking something and giving it back. That is the most basic way to think of consciousness, is that it is contacting something other than ourselves, and that other than ourselves contacting us, and there being some sort of reciprocal commerce between us.
And I already see there an invitation for the 2 chapters to come on value and purpose in capital P, and also the sacred. It's already like in this journey, I can already see those coming just from what you mentioned about, if the point of evolution is survival, why as humans here? Why the rest?
Yes.
Now, in this inversion of the question, this, again, it seems to offer a very comprehensive framework, not just to place in slime molds and plants and all these so-called altered state of consciousness, but also the transpersonal. And you allude to it, maybe not in these words, but you speak about, well, we have individual or personal consciousness, but perhaps it's nested in a wider kind of consciousness. Could you say something about that?
Well, in an earlier talk, you pointed to fractality, and I didn't at the time pick it up, but it's a very important element of the structure of living things and existing things, that they seem to have similarities of structure at different levels. And what we call a thing may be simply the particular level at which we come to be taking it in at the time. But anyway, that's to go off slightly on a tangent. I suppose what the question is what is the relationship between the idea that seemed rather separate, that there is consciousness in the cosmos, and there is a field of consciousness, and that I have this rather limited individual personal consciousness.
Yes.
And my way of understanding that relationship is that the whole purpose of all that constitutes my physical being is to filter consciousness, to limit consciousness in order to make my consciousness possible. Limit immediately suggests something negative to the modern mind, because we've imbibed the idea that we should have no boundaries, no limits, which is of course ridiculous, because everything comes into existence through having boundaries and limits. Otherwise it wouldn't be, which is really the point I'm making. Something becomes defined by literally the bounds of it. And so this business of paring away, cutting away, filtering down is creative. Most obviously, one sees it in the image of sculpture. When Michelangelo created his David, he didn't make a beautiful hand and stick it on a beautiful arm and put the arm on a torso. He started with a block of stone, and all he did was throw things away. That's why he was a very great artist. He simply chucked stone away. And at the end of it, there was the David. So the process of paring things down is vastly creative. And so there needs to be this process of resistance in the cosmos in order that there should be things. Now, what I love here, and again, William James, as so often, is the person who comes up with the perfect metaphor. He says, the thing about me is my individuality, my voice. What is my voice? It's the air passing from my lungs and out of my mouth. But if I didn't have a larynx, I couldn't have a voice. It's the very fact of there being an obstruction and a resistance to that flow of air which enables me to have a voice at all. And I would say that our being, including our brains, are about filtering the whole field of consciousness to make one thing stand forward, cutting away the rest of the stone for the time being so that this one sculpture can come into being. And I like that idea very much, but how is that related to the whole? Well, I think one can see that it's a part taken out of it. The fact that that William James has a voice doesn't take away from the fact that there's a capacity for everyone else to have a voice. But the image I find easiest for myself is that of a cell that may have arms or extensions, pseudopods, whatever you like to call them, that are parts of the cytoplasm that are extruded from the main part of the cell but remain connected to it. And if you situated yourself in the middle of one of these outpouchings of the cell, it would seem to you that you were surrounded on all sides and that you were isolated, unless you notice that at perhaps just 2% of this periphery of where you are, there is a connection into the cytoplasm of the whole cell. So you're not really disconnected at all. It's just that for present purposes, you're in something that shrouds most of the rest from you. So these are all just different ways of which you can express something is through an analogy, and an analogy will always be imperfect.
Yeah, no, beautiful. I mean, you made me think now of, for the first time as a neuroscientist, of brains as larynges and maybe mind as the air flowing through and giving it shape and a voice. It's very evocative to have a voice. Yes.
Yes.
Now, reaching to the end, we haven't mentioned enough in this chapter, and you do, the hemisphere hypothesis. And towards the end of the chapter, you speak about zombies and multiverses, maybe as symptoms of...
We must talk about those, yes,
please.
Yes. No, I talk about them because, of course, one of the ways in which philosophers now often try to explain the quite extraordinary fineness of the way in which the world appears to be arranged so that living beings can exist in it, is to talk about many worlds and to talk about multiverses. And effectively, I know they're different kinds of argument and address different problems, but the fact is that they very interestingly are an expression of precisely what happens to the left hemisphere when the right hemisphere is not functioning. It's a typical left hemisphere overdrive state, and we talked about this, what seems like years ago, but can't have been, when we were talking about some of the syndromes that affect people after right hemisphere damage. And one of them is reduplicative syndromes, in which there are many copies of the person in many different worlds, with all the city that they're in exists in 8, 10, 50 different examples. They exist in those cities in 8, 10, 50 places. And what's interesting is that this limitless multiplication of the person and of the worlds is a sign of right hemisphere deficits and left hemisphere overdrive. And it's also found, as one might expect, in schizophrenia. And I quote in the end of this chapter the case of a schizophrenic patient of a Japanese psychiatrist called Bin Kimura, who says that whenever I do something, the world splits into two. And what he imagined was that when he cleaned his teeth, the world split into two, one where he had cleaned his teeth and one where he hadn't. What is absolutely fascinating is that this precise scenario is one put forward by certain physicists and philosophers as to the possibilities of what is happening in the world. But I also quote Philip Ball taking Max Tegmark's to task for his enthusiasm for there being lots of other Maxes in the world, and how incoherent it is that if you have an infinite number of worlds, and the argument goes, if there are an infinite number of worlds, there will always be one in which this has to happen. Not just once, of course, but an infinite number of times. But if that is the case, you again cut the floor from under science, because nobody can say anything now and say this is more true or more real if all possible things get to be realized in some world, somewhere. So this is an utterly defeatist explanation, an incoherent explanation, a typically left hemisphere pathological projection, and doesn't seem to me to answer any questions. It simply kicks the can down the road. Because after all, if we are positing a cosmos in which all these amazing things can happen, you haven't solved the problem of why they happen in this world. You've now got the problem of why do they happen in all these worlds? What is the underlying cause of the being of all these worlds? So I just think it's interesting and amusing. And the other thing that happens to schizophrenics is they think people are machines, or they think they're zombies. or they think they themselves are a machine or a zombie equally. And this is very unusual in a normally functioning person. But as I have described in part one, part of what goes on in the chaining in Western Anglo-American analytic philosophy is the constant promulgation of the left hemisphere's take at the complete expense of any contribution from the right hemisphere, which actually sees more of the world and more of that reality. And this is why Bergson makes the point that there is a complete lack of the capacity. He doesn't call it the right hemisphere's capacity, but he talks of it of what comes from intuition, what comes from experience, having a place in philosophy. And I also, I'm afraid, showed that many of the great formative minds in the history of Western philosophy were either autistic or on the what psychiatrists call the schizo-autistic spectrum. And so it's hardly surprising that they should come up with these ideas and not be able to doubt them or know that they couldn't. That is what happens when one is on that spectrum and can't prove something is not the case. One becomes concerned that it may be the case. And it reminds me of the most famous example of all, which is Descartes, in the Discourse on Reason, looking outside, Discourse on Method, looking outside of the window and seeing people walking about in the square below and saying, but how am I to know that they are not just machines walking about dressed in coats and hats? And he had many features that suggest he could have been borderline schizophrenic. So once again, one's up against the left hemisphere's capacity to generate improbable scenarios and think that it somehow solved a problem, which could be much more parsimoniously and much more credibly solved by just for once allowing the possibility that the left hemisphere doesn't actually on its own understand and get everything and can't, in the nature of it, reason its way to solutions about these things. When you can't, it is only reasonable to adopt ideas that you don't now see there is a rational way towards. I use the example of, music. There's nothing irrational about music. It is just an experience that we, I hope, all have, that it is completely remarkable, but is not susceptible to explanation by reason. It is trans-rational, super-rational. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, thank you.
So what I'm really saying...
Yes. Yeah. No, I was just going to, as you want to inject kind of a really bird's eye view of the whole book at this stage where we are like towards the end of part 3, all your readers by now would have enjoyed these resonances you were talking about, between the neuropsychiatry, the epistemology we went through in part 2, and then the ontology. And now, after having spoken about the metaphysics of consciousness, well, again, how enlightening it is to rethink it in terms of the neuropsychiatry with which we started the book, and also how valuable this axis, this left-right brain axis you're offering to place the attempts to make sense of the world, how fruitful it's becoming. And it's metaphor, but it's more than metaphor, and it's, in a way, I think it's one of your main contributions, that we can now think all of these by reference to the actual neuropsychiatry of the hemispheres.
Well, yes, thank you for making that point. And I hope that is the case. In a way, sometimes we focus more on neuropsychiatry, sometimes on physics, sometimes on philosophy, whatever it may be. But these are all horses that are running together and in time with one another, and rather fruitfully, I believe, pulling chariot forwards on what it is that we can believe about ourselves and the world. And there is no way that everyone will agree with what I say for a minute. But there are plenty of people who are already finding it enormously persuasive. And as long as I can persuade some people that this is a useful way to think, that may be taken into account alongside many others, that's fine for me.
Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted, in conclusion, because I think this is interesting, to mention... You said enlightenment, and one of the things that people may be thinking is, well, no enlightenment thinker could think in these words. They'd all be mechanists, just like I am. But this is not true. Let me just quote something and then say who it's by. All is in perpetual flux. Every animal has something of the human. Every mineral has something of the plant. Plant has something of the animal. There is nothing circumscribed in nature. Each form has its own proper fortune or misfortune. From the elephant to the flea, from the flea to the sensitive and living molecule, the origin of everything. There is not a point anywhere in the whole of nature that does not suffer or take delight. Well, who is that from? Is it from Bergson? Is it from William James? Is it from a mystic? No, it's from Denis Diderot, one of the great Lumière, the great figures of the Enlightenment, from D'Alembert's Dream. So there was he, one of the very founders of the rationalistic vision of the Enlightenment, whose mind was broad enough, whose soul was great enough to see that it was wonderful to push forward rationalism as far as it'll go, but that leaves areas where rationalism won't answer your questions alone. So I am not anti-rational in any sense. I defend reason in part too, and I think that the demise of reason and the demise of science are worries that may be coming because of the way people are now talking about, anything goes, my opinion's as good as yours, and it's all part of some Western plot. I don't take this view at all. I take the view that these things are important, but just that they have their own proper bounds and limits.
Yes, bringing it back to everyday life, as I like to attempt, it would be like saying, well, am I a bad parent because I'm putting limits on what my children may do,
yes,
opposed to constantly tell them they have no limits and they can just do whatever they want.
Yes, well, you've illuminated one of the problems with the way we think now, which is that limits, resistance is negative, but it's what makes people what they are. We need that. In der Beschränkung zeigt sich erst der Meister, says Goethe. In limitation, the master first shows himself. And it's true of all art, of all thinking, that one is running against resistance, and it's that brings the spark. And so there is this great poet of the 17th century, Henry Vaughan, whose collection of poems was called Silex Scintillans, which means the flint that gives sparks. And so his idea of the soul, really, this is really wonderful, is that it is like sparks that are struck from the stone by a blow. So that at the origin of everything, there is this element of resistance that gives forth life. And that reminds me, sorry, my mind does this. I'm now thinking of the wonderful, I think I used it at the beginning of, yes, it's one of the three quotes with which I begin chapter 20, which is the quote from Hölderlin, that, could the spirit rise up in all its beauty if that wave had not to crash against the old rock of destiny? So it's this sense that he talks about the beauty of the spray that is the human soul coming out of this dashing against the hard old rock of destiny. Anyway, those images just come to mind for me.
Well, after 2 hours, that's totally understandable. Okay, so maybe my last comment is about the way you decided to end this chapter. You quote Stuart Sutherland. Consciousness is fascinating but elusive. It's impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written on it. And then you say, well, I cannot hope to have been an exception to this rule.
Right.
Is it a drop? Is this a mic drop at the end of this 80 pages? It's like, okay, have it your way.
Look, all we can do with any of these things is to adopt the view that we can just have a try to do something that can't really be done, and in the attempt to do it is better than the sort of refusal to even try.
Yeah.
I think that's behind also why I wrote the last chapter on the sacred, was outset that everything I said could be faulted, because nothing can be said on this topic without it being easy to fault. But not to say anything would have been a greater betrayal than to say what I could say, hedged round in various ways, knowing that what I said was inevitably going to be wrong in various ways. So I think the same thing probably applies to this chapter, that it's part of a conversation, as we've demonstrated this morning. And long live the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for saying it, Iain.
There we are. Thank you.
Right.
Okay. Well, that'll be it for today.
Yes.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.